heart together, given some of the recent happenings in our country, and just wanting to make sure that this is something we are thinking about and working towards. How do we bring more equity to education? Okay, so I am going to share a quick disclaimer here. So the views, thoughts, and opinions that are shared in this presentation and in this discussion, which I would like to really highlight that. I would like this to be a discussion. So we want everyone to feel able and welcome to share their opinions. So the views, thoughts, and opinions that are expressed here belong solely to each individual participant. These do not necessarily represent the participant's employer, their organization, any associated committees, groups, or individuals that they interact with. So just as that disclaimer, everybody is speaking for themselves within this presentation. Also, just as a note, there have been requests to record and share this conversation with individual school leaders who are unable to join us today. So it will be recorded. And if you'd like to receive a copy, you will need to request it. We are happy to share it, but it is not going to be a publicly available and posted video. So if you would like a copy of this, please just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to get that to you. As we go forward, there are a few background assumptions that I wanted to go over that we're kind of coming into this conversation with. So the background assumptions are that discussions of racism are typically not part of school culture or curriculum. And because racism is so complex and contentious, many of us are afraid to even broach the subject. Fears of opening a can of worms, stirring the pot, or making a mistake can be paralyzing. Often it feels easier and safer to just avoid the topic altogether. However, silence and inaction may reinforce the status quo. Going on further, we say that avoidance speaks volumes. It may communicate to students of color that racism doesn't matter enough to warrant attention. And by omission, it may invalidate their experiences, perspectives, and even their identities. White students, on the other hand, may see racism being accepted and normalized without acknowledgement or accountability on the part of their school leaders. So right now, what we're intending to do is creating a space, and a space that we can talk about this. What's going on in that quote, it says, creating a space to talk about race may open the way for some of the most powerful learning and change that you, your students, your colleagues, and your school will ever experience. These skills are best learned through collective dialogue with others committed to addressing racial equity, as well as through lots of practice. When discussions of race and racism become normalized, the promise of equity can be realized. So that's kind of the background that we are working on today. I do see a note on our chat. If you are not speaking, please mute your mic. Sounds like some feedback. Thank you so much. Okay, so with that as our background, I do want to dive into just a few little self-reflections and some intention setting for our conversation today. So here's our first slide. It says, consider the following statements and select the one that best describes how you feel. And this isn't something you need to necessarily share out, but just to kind of think about. Are you on the end where I would rather not talk about race and racism? Are you very uncomfortable talking about it? Are you sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes comfortable, or are you very comfortable talking about race and racism? So something to think on. How are you coming into this conversation today? And then we'll follow that as you've kind of decided on where you are at with those statements with a sentence stem activity to self-reflect. So we have some pieces here of sentence stems. You might choose the sentence stem. The hardest part of talking about race and racism is. You might choose the beneficial part of talking about race and racism is. Maybe my own experience of race has taught me, or my students' experiences of race are different from mine because. Now, this can absolutely be something to just self-reflect and think on. This might be something you want to grab a paper and a pen and jot down. If you're comfortable, you are welcome to share in the chat or to even unmute and let us know kind of where you're at with this. Of course, these are all optional sharing at this point. So if you are not comfortable speaking about your self-reflection yet, that's okay. But if anyone wants to share kind of how they are coming into this conversation and maybe use one of these sentence stems, I would welcome that at this point.
Okay, I'll share. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I mean, I have thoughts about each of them as I read, but I just like the beneficial part of talking about race and racism. I think it's important for perspective because I think we forget sometimes the experiences others have had, and to get a perspective is really important so that we can be open-minded to thoughts and ideas and solutions. And one way that I especially came to know that was by doing home visits for students. And it was really beneficial to me as a teacher when I was a teacher to see that side. So it gave me perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. There is a comment in the chat that says the hardest part of talking about race and racism is other people's discomfort with the topic. I know myself coming into this conversation, I feel like for me, the hardest part of talking about race and racism is worrying. Like, what if I say something wrong? Or what if I accidentally offend someone? And knowing myself that I want to have good intentions, but what if that is not recognized? Or what if I misspeak about something? So I know for me, that is the hardest part of talking about it. We've got another comment in the chat. They said the beneficial part of talking about race is that students of color hear you and know you are listening to them. It exists, and not talking about it makes students think you are ignoring what they go through. Excellent point. We'll give just a few more seconds if anyone has any other pieces they want to share. I'm sure there is a lot of self-reflection happening right now as well, too. And I believe some of you are also viewing in a group setting. So hopefully you can even engage in some conversations with your own group that you're with as well. All right, well, we'll keep moving forward here. All right, so I've got a few intentions that I'm hoping we can set for our conversation here. So the first intention kind of speaks to do you worry about your ability to answer questions about race and racism? If so, I would hope that you can set an intention to commit to accepting that you don't have all the answers and embrace the opportunity to learn with your students, with your staff, and with us here today. The next one, do you feel ill-prepared to talk about race and racism? And if so, then I hope that your intention can be a commitment to learning more about the issues by studying history, following current events, and brushing up on anti-racism work. The next question, do you reroute discussions when you sense resistance or anger in the room? And if that is where you are at, I hope you can set an intention to commit to writing out the discussion next time and seeing where it can lead to. And finally, if you feel isolated in your experience of race and racism, then I hope that you can set an intention for a commitment to identify a friend or a colleague with whom you can plan or debrief as you work through learning throughout this topic. And then we have a quote to finally get us started, and then we'll get into some real, hopefully good discussion items. So this quote, I think I found really encouraging. It says, the more you engage in and moderate difficult conversations, the more confident you'll become and the more comfortable. Conversations may not necessarily get easier, but your ability to press toward more meaningful dialogue will expand. Stay engaged. The journey is worth the effort. So again, to me, that just seemed hopeful going into this. Stay engaged with us, and this journey is going to be worth the effort we put into it. So the way that I've set this up, now that we've done some background and kind of identified where we're coming into the conversation at, and hopefully set some intentions for ourselves, is that I have a few different quotes. And these quotes I pulled out from the book White Fragility. I did reference that in one of the emails that I sent. That book is primarily written to white people from the perspective of a white author. And throughout the book, there are lots of great pieces I agreed with. There are pieces I didn't agree with, but it was really good to start thinking about how to approach a conversation. And in it, the author shares a lot of reasons why she feels like sometimes as white individuals, we have a hard time with this topic and what we can do to be more meaningfully engaged in it. I didn't pull out everything from the book. It is, quite a long book, and I would be happy to dive into that more with you if you would find that beneficial. But I did pull out 4 different quotes from the book and thought that might be a good place that we could start this conversation today. The way that I set it up is I'm going to share a quote and I'll leave it up for a minute or two to kind of let you think on it. And then I will pose a discussion question. And some of the quotes actually end with a question. We don't necessarily have to speak to that question. We can if you would like to, but there are specific discussion questions as well. If in any of those discussion topics, we end up going a different direction with it or spending more time, or it leads to other questions, I certainly want to be flexible and let this conversation go where it's naturally going to flow to. If we do not get through the 4 different quotes, then this would certainly be where we can pick up next time. If we do get through it and have additional time, we can maybe brainstorm some additional topics that we would like to engage in. I hope that you will find this to be a safe and respectful experience. Again, with the intention that I think everyone is coming into this wanting to be respectful and kind in their conversation. So please feel free to share. You again are welcome to unmute and turn on your video if you want. Just unmute if you just want to speak. You're welcome to throw it up in the chat button or chat box, excuse me. But really hoping that this can be a conversation that you are engaged and participating in. So our first think about quote says, if I conceptualize racism as binary and I place myself on the not racist side, what further action is required of me? No action is required because I'm not a racist. Therefore, racism is not my problem. It doesn't concern me, and there is nothing further I need to do. So I'll kind of leave that up for a minute just to think about, and I will pull up our discussion question. Or maybe I'll show you the discussion question, then come back to this slide. So our question that we're going to ask are, what are the implications of this explanation? And how does the good-bad binary impact the way that we talk about historical or contemporary figures in school? So those are the discussion points I want to lead to on here. As I mentioned, if it ends up leading to a different comment, that is certainly okay too. But thinking about what are the implications of this explanation and how does the good-bad binary impact how we talk about historical or contemporary figures in school. So I will now go back to that quote. And if you're ready to share, please, again, feel free, video and mic, just the mic, use the chat box. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Hanif Yogu speaking from Beehive Academy.
Hi.
I really appreciate you organizing this. I find it very meaningful and timely. Thank you very much. Now, I personally believe that racist is definitely not sufficient because we certainly have a very dominant, intentionally or unintentionally, there are some sort of institutionalized racism going around. Some may agree with, some part may not. That's definitely, being non-racist is definitely good, but not sufficient because you have to be anti-racist. Otherwise, you somehow agree with what's at least around you and you don't intend to act or do anything about it. So at some level it's okay, but I believe that it's not sufficient. I personally believe that I should be more than that. That like, that at least unintentionally, even if we are like, agreeing with what's happening around, we need to really changes or improves. That's how I feel. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are some great thoughts. Rob, I think I saw that you raised a hand. Would you like to share?
Sorry, I did that on accident. My apologies.
No problem. I'll go back to those questions now too, so we can see those and focus on those.
Marie, I have something to say. This is Jennifer.
Please go ahead, Jennifer.
One thing, when I'm talking to my friends who are of different races, they tell me that a lot of times they feel that people who they may not be racist, but they still feel excluded by them. And I just want to, I like the idea that it's not just binary, because if it's binary, then you say, okay, well, I'm not out there being racist, so therefore I'm just fine. But there may be actions that we all do and engage in that are exclusionary. And by being exclusionary, the person may feel just as hurt as if we were being racist. And so I think that we do need to maybe look at all of our actions on a continuum and be able to recognize that it isn't just whether or not I am trying to be accepting or racist, but whether or not I am doing anything that excludes others.
Thank you. I liked that idea about the continuum. And that is the point that the author does make in the White Fragility book, that often we see it as a binary, either I'm racist or I'm not, but that she argues that it is much more of a continuum, and that we're all at some point along the continuum and we're working towards being less racist, or, Hanifi pointed out, even anti-racist, but that it's working throughout this continuum in our lives. So perhaps we maybe spend a minute on the second question. So if we are operating from a good-bad binary, which in some cases, I think that is something we can see, how does that then impact how we talk about historical or contemporary figures or events in our schools?
Marie, I also think there's some really good comments in the comment box, and that maybe you may want to invite some of those individuals to expound a little bit further.
Oh, I see that here. Sorry, I was watching it and it was apparently not scrolling. So let me scroll down now and see. Let's see. Oh, and we had even more great comments on the previous question too. Okay, let me start here. It looks like we've got a few comments. Working in different school environments, I learned the significant disparity and systemic racism at play through education and curriculum. These experiences changed my life as I was forced to talk and listen, and as I looked in the mirror in a real way. Someone else said, my own experience is unique because I have a multiracial family, which gives me lots of perspectives. I am white, but I have a son from Ethiopia and 2 children from Asia. Another person had mentioned about the hardest part is talking about racial issues and inappropriate joke, inclusivity. Sorry, I struggle with that word. Okay, let me come down now. Let's get to some of our comments specifically about this question. You have to be more than not racist. You must be anti-racist to change. That seems to be a common thread we're hearing, and I love the idea. We have another one that says a binary consideration leads to either lionizing or demonizing others. It doesn't lead to a realistic understanding of our history. And I've just learned a new word, so I'm going to look that one up after. Thank you for that. Another one says that binary oversimplifies the actual spectrum of biases, unconscious feelings, and socialized behaviors that we may not even realize we have. Another one says, I believe the binary idea creates no space for discussion, no ways of looking at different points of view, no discussion around social histories, etc. Another individual said, it means you are only concerned about what impacts yourself. Being quiet is complicit to the problem. Students are then not taught historical and powerful leaders on the issue and do not feel they can engage. Another one said, I believe the binary idea creates no discussion.
No.
Sorry, do we have somebody making a comment? I'll keep reading in that case. Another one says, you were either racist or not. Quiet doesn't make you not a racist. That's a really good quote there. This one says, wow, this is a standard that connects to so much in the American culture. Win or lose, right or wrong, racist or not, true or untrue, it's a cultural phenomenon. This is a systemic problem that propagates racism, whether intentional or unintentional. Dorothy pointed out on that one as well that it's also speaking to white or not white. This one says, it's difficult to have the conversation if you are part of the male white dominated group. It does not even matter what you say because of your stereotype, but it is your actions. It was not until I had a daughter of color that I was personally experiencing the subconscious bias. We have another quote, thought. It says, I think it is important to recognize it in itself, the spectrum of racism. Just because you are not being explicitly racist, your bias could be leading to microaggressions, which are just as damaging. As far as history, it does not include people of color and their contribution, even our own civil wars. So those are some really great thoughts on that. Does anybody from the chat, I know I shared a lot of thoughts there, want to expound or speak any further on their comments? We welcome your voice as well. All right, well, it sounds like I'm going to be your reader then, so we will keep it up. And thank you so much for being willing to share your thoughts there about the implications of the explanation of racism binary. And overall, we agree that racism definitely is not a binary concept. And as we've discussed, how the good, bad binary can sometimes impact how we view historical or contemporary figures or events. It sounds like we are understanding that it definitely helps us, or it makes it hard for us to see life as it really is and history as it really is and where contributions lie on both sides of the issue. If there are any other comments on here, please feel free to stop me. Otherwise, we'll go on to our next thought to think about. Okay, so here is our next think about thought. This one says, how has the use of coded language, such as urban, inner city, disadvantaged, how has that coded language kept you and your colleagues from having open and honest conversations about race and racism in education? So that's going to be our think about question. Let me share with you as well what the follow-up discussion question is. It is, how does having open and honest conversation about race and racism in education increase opportunities for quality education for all students? So that's what we're looking at. How do we increase opportunities for quality education for all students? Excuse me, I hit one too many arrows. So back to just that think about question. How does coded language keep us from having these conversations? And maybe thinking about when you're describing urban, inner city, disadvantaged students, what is it we're really saying? And why are we using coded language to speak about that? And we'll open that up for any comments when you're ready. So perhaps I can also help us get started thinking about this a little deeper as well. One thing that I found really interesting that I had honestly never really thought about as an educator, and through my own life as a student, then life as a teacher, then as a school director, I'd honestly never really stopped and thought about this, that the author in the White Fragility book points out. She talks about how a lot of times if we have students at an urban school or at an inner city school or who are disadvantaged, a lot of times the solution is we're going to bus them to a good school, or we're going to offer them, other choices of schools. And that often it flows one direction, from the urban environment to a suburb, from the inner city to coming out of the inner city, from a disadvantaged population flowing to a advantaged population. But she pointed out the fact that often it doesn't flow the other direction. So we don't have students who are from an advantaged school pouring into a disadvantaged school. We aren't busing students from the good high school down to the less good or the urban or the inner city high school. And I just thought that was an interesting point to consider, that often it only flows one direction. And the point that she brought out was often when we are using these words such as urban, inner city, disadvantaged, what we're really describing is often our students of color. And if we really look at it for what it is, how can that change the opportunities that we're giving to all of our students in education? It does look like we have some chat thoughts coming in, so I will start sharing those as well. If anybody wants to speak to that, please feel free to weigh in as well.
Hey, Marie, this is Todd. I'll go ahead and speak to the soft one, the comment
awesome.
I had about soft racism.
Thank you, Todd.
So before we moved to Utah, I taught at a normal city district at a big city in Texas. And the city was kind of divided geographically by the interstate that went through. And most of the neighborhoods that were on the east side of that divide were economically disadvantaged. And most of the families that lived there were Black and Hispanic. The district rolled out a direct teaching model for the district, and they piloted it in the east side of the city where all of the Black and Hispanic students were, as a cure for low academic performance, while all of the kids that were on the west side of the city, which were mostly white middle-class neighborhoods, they were doing project-based learning and problem-based learning and really interactive things like this, whereas the direct teaching model was rolled out for the Black and Hispanic kids. It's racism. I mean, it was. And thankfully, there were a few people that stood up and said, hey, wait a minute. You don't get to do project-based learning for all the white kids and then make the Black and Hispanic kids sit through direct teaching. I mean, come on. So thankfully, that was changed after a couple of years. But that's an example of how embedded that is sometimes in education, that we think, well, we'll do this special program, or we'll do this or this for those certain neighborhoods, because there's an underlying assumption that they can't do what white kids can do. That's what I meant by that.
Thank you, Todd. I think you make some excellent points there on that. Thank you for sharing that personal example as well. We have another comment in here. She said, I think perhaps it brings the view in these communities as having a deficit or as being incorrect. For example, with code switching, how students communicate between themselves or with their families may lead to them as having a lower IQ or coming from a certain neighborhood and the stereotypes associated with that community. It's not just about racism, but about our biases with the intersection of poverty, for example. I think that for me, it can sometimes mean a harder job because of all the barriers without recognizing the strengths. Another member of our group said that the problem here is that it doesn't address the biases that lead to the lower performance or expectations. Address it through data without ego. How are our students performing and what is the why for why they aren't? Let's see, we had another one here. It says, we use code switch to sound as if we aren't talking about race. Therefore, we must not be racist. And look, that ties into that binary that we sometimes see as a system. Consequently, it deflects the discussion away from racism to other societal features like class. Let's see, this individual said, redlining is what made the change in your old district, Todd. Historic way to avoid giving loans to people of color. There's another agreement for what Todd said. Coded language has inherent negative connotation. It's rarely used in conversations about, say, gifted and talented programs. Thought here that we're saying not a change, but a condition. This one says, the language makes us comfortable. Saying that one works at an inner city school has the connotation that it's high poverty, large minority groups, gangs, etc. We can look at white flight in cities and see the comfort of the verbiage. I worked in downtown Cleveland and the verbiage was common, working in the city versus in the suburbs. Someone said, using this language can sometimes remove ourselves or our colleagues from the experience of our students. And that we also had another agreement with Jody that it creates a comfort zone and a distance from the students themselves. So excellent. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to share on that? I think these have been some really good points to think about and to discuss with each other. We'll come back to that question, just make sure that we've addressed it the way.
Marie, if I can
Yes,
just
please.
jump in. This is
Go ahead.
Jennifer. One thing that I know the state Superintendent Dixon especially is trying to get us to all think in very differently about how we word things. And that a lot of times what we do is we put the label first. So we say disadvantaged students. And so what are we seeing that student as? We're seeing that student as first disadvantaged instead of as an individual that student is. And so even in our language, if we can just try to flip that, we're talking about the student first and not their supposed category first. And so, instead of saying, black students, say students of color, or instead of saying special education students or IEP students, you say students who are on IEPs. And that's a small difference, and it's still categorizing students, but it's putting the student first, which maybe can help us think of the individual first rather than just categorizing everyone into these little buckets.
That's a great point. Thank you, Jennifer. Gloria, I see that you are unmuted. Are you wanting to share with us? Maybe not. All right. I will. There's a few more chats that came in. Dorothy shared that white flight was set up by loaning institutions. Areas of cities were set up as very desirable, and then desirable, not desirable. And loaning institutions would give loans to the not desirable, or wouldn't give loans, excuse me, to the not desirable. Then highways would run through those areas, displacing those who were already vulnerable. White set up barriers between races, and that needs to be known. We had another comment speaking about the student first, same thing with the at-risk, rather than calling them at-risk students, how do we see that student first? And Chair Tonks from our State Charter School Board also weighed in, yes, there's a big emphasis on student first language. And thank you for that reminder. Any other thoughts on this, or we'll move to our third quote to think about and discuss?
This is Brett at Ames. Just on this question, having an open and honest conversation. We are so polarized, particularly in Utah, where not everybody has great interactions with people of color, that honest and open are defined differently by so many different people. I can talk to my students in what I think is correct, but then I'm open for criticism because I'm speaking from a research basis. If I do it from a research basis, when you do research, there is bias. When you study schools and you collect school-wide data, you see the bias. And I think it's subconscious, but it's there. The difficulty is then having a conversation about race, racism, our history, what's written in our texts, becomes very difficult because it's not the student interaction, it's not the student teaching, it's then the reactions of stakeholders or really people that are non-stakeholders in what you're doing. And it has to, so if you're going to have those conversations with students, there's a relationship base behind that. We all know our students. We all know what we're striving to do in our schools, and that codes having the ability to have those discussions. But if you're viewing that from the outside, you don't have that context. Without having that context, every word that you say or every sentence or the general tone can be taken out of context. So that's, and we've experienced it kind of this year as we've responded to some issues and talked about it openly, or not openly, depending on how it is in terms of what happens. The difficulty is people can look at that and not understand where you're coming from, the context and the work that you've done to build up those relationships, to have those conversations with your students. I think that's one of the things that hampers us from sometimes having those, is it works for our students and it works within the context of our building, but anybody looking from the outside in doesn't understand the work and the relationships that went into having those conversations.
That's a really good point. And I like that you also brought up with that, so that you are putting in the work and the effort, and that it is often not seen, because I think doing the work really becomes a private, a personal experience, or even, like you said, within your school community or your school family. But then, as an outsider looking in, how do we then share what we've learned as we've done that work? Brett, I also appreciated that you acknowledged that ultimately there is bias in all of this. And so having an open and honest conversation, how does recognizing and owning that bias then lead to more productive conversations? And it sounds like that's exactly what you're speaking to with doing the work and continuing to learn and grow together. We have another thought in chat that just says, when you look at the standards, we need to evaluate what is taught historically and include more than white European versions of history. When we teach history, we say a lot more. This person asked, she says, I'm struggling to understand, however, and I would like to. Are we discussing building bridges for white voices and the voices of people of color to be heard for common ground? Does anyone want to speak to that? How do we build bridges? Let's see, looks like some of our comments there say, let's see. I agree, but it can't stop us. We have to be willing to share what was done to lead us to a point to where we are. So if on the topic of equity, I would like to explore a conversation on how to do that. Okay, so let's dive into that. How do we do that? Maybe Brett, it sounds like you were speaking about some of the relationships that you've been able to build. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing that, but how do we begin to build those relationships for those open and honest conversations with our students and our staff?
Hanif, I know Brett was going to speak, but I am going to speak about him. That's why I wanted to kind of jump in. I was part of a team visiting his school for accreditation, so I somehow had like chance to interact with some of his staff. So not only like among staff and the students, but also among students, I think I have seen an kind of like a great culture that students were freely talking about some of those issues, and they were somehow like aware and discuss. Wanted to draw our attention to not as educators and with our students, but also among our students, among themselves, creating that safe environment so that they can also, bring up the thoughts, idea, explore this, so that it's really kind of like impacting our students, because they are definitely going to be the future and taking this further and improving this. But unless we bring them into part of that discussion, I don't think, we are really doing a large scale kind of like a thing for to echo that and say that a great kind of discussion among the students in Brett's school that firsthand I had the chance to listen to them. Thank you.
So that's very kind. I appreciate you mentioning that. Let me just give you an example of the risks you take doing that. We want our students to have a voice. Teenagers, adolescents say all the time they don't have a voice. So we try giving them a voice. What happens if somebody disagrees with their voice? Whether it's another student, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's outside parents. And the challenge is giving your students a voice puts you in a position to do a lot more work and a lot more negotiating around these issues. And it does give you the opportunity to have some discussions. It's hard because even I think we have provided some opportunities for students to have voices. It's not without its challenges. We offer a class and had the university set up a class, and the class is basically race and gender. It's a University of Utah class that meets one of the general education credit requirements. But that's still a challenge. An 18-year-old student at Ames discussing some of these topics views it differently than that same 18-year-old would 3 months later at the University of Utah, with a little bit more clarity and a little bit more maturity those months give. And I, as the administrator, have to be vigilant about how our students are taking those conversations, how the instructor is facilitating those conversations, and actually be aware of what some of those conversations are, so that when I get those negative phone calls, I can deal with it. That's the flip side of having that opportunity for students. I do believe it is something we have to do. I do believe it's something we could do better. And the challenge for me right now is when I look on the TV, I see my students and former students leading some of the protests in our own city. I would love to bring them back and have them engaged in our own activism. But that's the question. Where's the boundaries? Where's those walls between being politically neutral as an administrator and as a school versus having these open conversations? Because we know that many of the things that we try and do become politicized. That's my 2 cents right now.
You bring up a lot of good points there. Thank you so much, Brett, and thank you for being willing to share. A few other points that came up on chat. So Susie, I definitely agree with you that I think this is going to be, an ongoing conversation of how do we do that. And I think, as we mentioned, this is kind of that beginning stage. And so I would definitely like to continue on that point as well. And she did point out to us that as of right now, the white voices are dominant voice. And I actually wanted to speak to that for a minute, and not as an excuse or anything there, but just really kind of sharing the approach here. This was actually one of the big concerns that I had going into this conversation, is that here I am, a white woman about to lead this conversation, and who am I, or why should I lead this conversation? And in doing my learning and my research and coming into this, one thing that I found that I thought was really interesting was that for the most part, and this isn't assuming to speak for everybody, but that our Black brothers and sisters, our Black people in our communities right now, they're tired. They have been suddenly asked to be experts on like everything. And I definitely want to make sure that we are giving opportunity for those other voices to be heard. But the prevailing thought that kept coming in the research that I was doing was that for right now, we have a lot of resources out there. And that right now, one of the things we need to do as whites and other individuals is put in some of that work and that effort to come to some better understandings. And I think there will definitely be a time and a place where we need to make sure that, we're raising more of those voices of color, but that in one of the articles I read, it spoke to even just the privilege of saying, you're a person of color, I want you to teach me how to do this, is in some ways a racist thought, because you're again expecting them to do the work for you and to give you all those pieces that you need instead of wanting to put in that work ourselves. So I do recognize and understand that as a white woman a white woman right now, maybe my voice is not the best voice for this, but I'm hoping that was the care and the intention that I brought into this, was that wanting us to be able to have that conversation and start doing the work ourselves, and then definitely, adding to that conversation as we go forward. We have another thought here. Someone who said, thinking about open and honest conversations. The most meaningful conversations have been those when I've been called out myself to my own microaggressions or incorrect comments. It's important, particularly thinking of white fragility, to be willing and able to see your own bias and listen when someone is calling you out for it. And that will lead into one of the other think about questions that we have, but I would agree with that, seeing it first ourselves and then being able to work on that. We have another question. Someone said, how many schools have done diversity training, equity in education actually led by Black voices and experts? So that would be a question we can discuss. There was a comment back to that someone said, great idea, especially in Utah. That can be a challenge here. Someone says we have to share multiple viewpoints of history through primary source documents, giving something other than white perspective. We have to create classrooms where every child feels respected, whether or not they're agreed with. And this work is hard, like Brett said. This one says, rather than giving a voice, I wonder if we can explore tools. To be fair to the teenagers, even as adults, we are struggling to have these hard conversations. I don't think we can just provide opportunity without tools. And then Todd shared one tool is that he teaches students to agree with the idea rather than the person. People get defensive very quickly when they feel that other people are against them. Another individual said the most effective, meaningful tool is representation. Students of color will use their voices when they see teachers of color leading the conversation and setting the example. Hiring practices need to be deeply examined. I was an agreement with that, and we need more diversity in teachers. This one says we will need to talk about disparity among schools, how many times we need to explain to our students why some schools receive more funding than others. It's just not about race, it's also about economic disadvantage. Someone says, I worry that students who have English as a second language are at risk of becoming victims of racism. Has anyone seen that in their schools, and what could be done to help them? Someone commented they have seen that and they think that it needs to be addressed also. We have another tool here. CNN has a podcast right now entitled Silence is Not an Option, and it pertains to this discussion. Someone said this is not just a black and white issue. And there was agreement there. We conduct multicultural education and celebration of diversity. So any other comments, thoughts? I know a few questions were raised in the chat. We've got a yes with 4 exclamation points. Another thought, also thinking about being honest and open with our students in classrooms allows for them and their voice to own their experience and know they will not be targeted or shot down. Excellent points. As I mentioned, I think this will lead nicely, and I know from some of the comments, this should lead into our next question here. So let's look at that. I did get a notification that the USBE meeting is actually starting with a closed executive session. So we can run a little bit longer on our meeting, probably till about 1:20, 1:30, and then still end in time for everybody to join, or 2:30, to be able to join in that meeting as well. So the Think About thought here says, and this is again the author of that White Fragility book speaking. So she says, in my workshops, I often ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our unaware yet inevitable racism? How often has that gone well for you? Eye rolling, head shaking, and outright laughter follow, along with the consensus of rarely, if ever. I then ask, what would it be like if you could simply give us feedback, have us graciously receive it, reflect, and work to change the behavior? Recently, a man of color sighed and said, it would be revolutionary. So that's our Think About. I'll come back to that. The question that goes with that says, how do we create conditions for sustained engagement in uncomfortable conversations about race and racism without being sidetracked by individual discomfort? Which, as I said, I think that that ties along with some of the thoughts that we had there about, how do we continue this? How do we seek that feedback and then work through that feedback to graciously receive it, reflect, and then change our behavior? So that's kind of our next topic. I'm seeing some chats come in. If anyone wants to speak to that, again, feel free. It looks like from our chat, I'll start here. We have some agreements with Angela's comments. Thank you, Angela. Also, it says we cannot expect Black kids to answer all questions that we have about Black experience. Absolutely. Books some friends across the country recommend. So here's some more tools. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This one says they're agreeing with Dorothy. Exactly. Or have Black kids honestly be able to be honest about how our forefathers were slave owners and how that honestly feels for them. Someone said in regards to this question, keep the conversation positive and focused on being heard and understood rather or instead of agreeing. Another book recommendation, Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Someone says, can we have the chat from this so we can get titles of these books? Yes, I will get that for you. This one says, I think it goes to privilege. How do I receive information that speaks to my privilege as a cisgendered woman, for example? Would it be uncomfortable for me to hear that I said or did something that builds a wall rather than a bridge? Yes, but it is in that discomfort that we create safe spaces. I think that's a really excellent thought there. A few more books. Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Said. And someone said, I just finished Between the World and Me, so powerful. Change and growth comes in those uncomfortable conversations. So there was some questions asked there, some different viewpoints posed, some great book recommendations. Thank you so much. So how do we help establishing that it's okay to be uncomfortable in these conversations? Or, going back to this question, how do we create conditions where we can sustain engagement without being sidetracked by individual discomfort? Dorothy says she keeps coming back to the word graciously in the quote. Thank you. I would agree with that one. Let's see. Susie says, you accept that you will make mistakes and don't take being called out as a personal attack. Excellent. And remembering that ultimately it's not about us. It's about fixing this system that we are born into and maybe a part of. This says, this think about point is so powerful. Majority group can be powerful allies and learn, but by listening to the different perspectives. Thanks, Angela. One thing that I really took away from this was when we are engaged in the work of dealing with race and racism, again, how do we elevate the voices to be heard and not focus the attention back on ourselves? This was actually a conversation I had with my own daughter last night, and we were talking about some of the protests and the riots and the different experiences, and she was talking about how it was so sad. And I said, absolutely, it's sad. And I said, but if you were to go somewhere and just start crying about it, that detracts the whole conversation. And now everyone's trying to focus on how do we help you feel better? And that absolutely detracts from to focus the time, the effort, and the attention right now. And I think for me, that was a good realization. Working through that book is that we need to make sure that we're allowing the conversation and the focus to be driven by where our attention really needs to be. There's a few more thoughts that came through. Let's see. I think sometimes it can be valuable to let students offer comments without names on them. This can help students feel like they're being heard but not isolated. Excellent thought. Another one, keep it focused on the discussion. Excellent. Although it can be tricky to get right, starting an uncomfortable conversation with humor helps break the ice and allows people to let their guard down a bit. Always a good strategy. Another one says, let's see, we must first examine our own possible biases, conscious, implicit, or explicit. Another one says, going into it, not expecting these conversations to be comfortable. Just lean into the uncomfortable and remember that change is not usually comfortable, but the conversations need to be had. Excellent, Shelley. Thank you so much for that good reminder. Another one says, write it down, let the students submit them. The teacher then addresses them with the questions or the comments. English, with an English teacher background, it's so much great conversation that can come from writing. Another individual, and I think this is a good point here too, it says, I think it's important to have faculty and staff that can have these conversations. How do we get to that point? I'm not sure it would happen at school. I think that's a really excellent question, and maybe we can spend some time there. How do we help our faculty and our staff get to those points that we can have these types of conversations?
Well, Marie, can I just talk? I just think about some of our staff meetings, and I think about how our, if you can have normal conversations about basic things, and you have that environment of trust, that's step one. You have to have an environment where they respect each other and that they listen and they trust each other so that you can get to higher level conversations. If you don't have that base, you're not going to be able to have conversations like this among your staff. And I think that extends to the classroom. If you create an environment of respect, an environment of listening, and you kind of create these guidelines and these classroom norms, the students who may not normally speak up will feel comfortable because they know they're not going to be shot down or they're not going to be disrespected or hurt, but that they will be listened to, not necessarily agreed with. So I think a major aspect of whether it's with the adults or the students is the element of respect.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. That is very much an important part. Brett said here that they did a forum on shootings in Utah and had a SWAT officer and Lex Scott from Black Lives Matter come and present, and it went well. Students can be balanced and are generally more able to have conversations than some of us, as we have skeletons in the closet, so to speak. And I think we got another really good question here. She asks, what do we do if we have a teacher who truly is racist? How do we help them?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
So going back to Amanda's comment, providing that safe spot to speech is important. But at the same time, the students need to go in understanding that people are going to disagree with them. And they are going to have and be presented with situations that are completely different from them. We had a policy in place around our clubs and around having students have a safe place to speak. We had a faculty member violate that. Completely violated the student's opportunity for safety in speaking. That's one of those things that becomes incumbent upon us as administrators then to deal with. And we went a month and a half without a math teacher because I determined that was not acceptable. That's the downside of that. If you truly believe in this, you gotta be aware for some of those unexplained, unplanned, unwanted consequences of taking a stance to giving students a voice and having some safety around it. Because we see here in Salt Lake, we see on the news, not everybody has the point that people having open conversation and people not, how should I say this? Racism is alive and well, and some people are very comfortable with having that as part of who and what we are. And that's part of being open with our students. It's out there, and there's some people that don't want it to change.
Thank you, Brett. I think Susie brought up a good point here. She says, I don't think we're talking about disagreements, though. I think we're talking about explicit racism. It seems to me that there should be schools have that disciplinary policies for that, which I would agree with. And I think too, if we do come back to that idea of a racist teacher, I think we then need to also think back to that first think about question. Is racism on the binary or is it on a continuum? And so if you're looking at it as a binary, then absolutely you either have a racist teacher or not a racist teacher, right? And that will inform what you're going to do next. But if you see it along a binary, could it possibly be an opportunity to teach? And I know there were some of those comments earlier about some of the best learning can come from sometimes getting called out on things or being made aware of things. So I think that's absolutely something you'd want to consider in that point too. Dorothy does point out that it's in state code about having those disciplinary policies for situations of like blatant racism.
Yeah, I'm not even talking necessarily about racism. It's around giving students the opportunity to be safe, to have those conversations. And when that is violated, if you allow that to happen, then you're not going to have an open situation for student speech and for students to have a space. Even if it doesn't meet state code or anything like that, you've got to take on the aspect of students have a right to speak about, well, I'll give you the specifics. Students were talking about their experience with racism.
Perfect. Thank
We
you.
can't interfere with their opportunity to talk about racism from our perspective, because once we do that, we've eliminated the safe zone to talk from their perspective. So that's more what I was talking about in terms of then stepping in and making sure that students still felt supported and we as adults knew where our place was.
Perfect. Thank you. Susie also weighed in. She says, even if they're not being explicitly racist, admin would set expectations on how we treat students. And if teachers cannot do so, then maybe that setting is not the best place. Also, I believe that it is okay to accept that some people have views. And as a person of color, I would say that it is more valuable for those teachers to say, I cannot serve this population as I deserve, and try to only serve a population they can. I mean, why force yourself to serve a community you cannot view on equal ground? It's a disservice to all. Simon said we wouldn't tolerate racism from our students. Teachers are held to a higher standard and should not be welcome in the classroom. And Susie, there was some agreement with your comment as well. So any other thoughts on this component? Otherwise, let's move to last piece. And I do recognize, like I said, this is a big conversation, and trying to squeeze it into an hour and a half really feels like we are scratching the tip of the iceberg. So this is definitely something I think that we will want to continue. And I think we've had a lot of good discussion prompted today. Hopefully you've also had some good thoughts and things to think about. But if you're okay with final comment. Oh, Hanifi, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add, I believe, of course, you know, the thoughts are great and I appreciate them. At the same time, I believe that, you know, the culture of school matters. I mean, like in your school, what you are focusing, I mean, what are kind of like, you know, catching the attention, what kind of things you are promoting in your community, like activity wise. I mean, in all different aspects of it, if you see, I think it somehow like set the stone what you are focusing, like in, because the diversity is somehow part of our mission, trying to really actively promote that. And looking at, you know, we somehow like, you know, look into all of our different operations, all of our different activities, all of our different events, and any and every aspects of the school we look for. That's who we are and what we are trying to be. And like, just to give you an example, when we hire the teachers, in a set of questions that we ask our staff candidates, we ask them like, opinion diverse, do they serve in a diverse environment, what kind of like, you know, strategies they could bring that could serve different background of the students. Like some of those questions at the beginning and getting their opinions somehow first let us select the candidates we think are going to best serve, as well as gives them like, you know, what the set stone is here in this school, because these are some of the important things that we appreciate or value in this school. So if you are joining, know that this is what we are for you at the beginning. So I believe that it really kind of like plays into that as well. Thank you.
Perfect. I would definitely agree with that, that, you know, we set that tone from the very first experience they have in our school. Angela weighed in on that too. She said, we as directors must show there is no place for racism in our school, which is where something Simon said is the key. We need to know our own bias and work on it. Oftentimes the racism is not blatant. We need to understand the subtlety of racism. When a parent, a student, a colleague complaint, then we can see it clearly and understand when it is a microaggression. Then we had here just a thank you. This is a tough topic. Looks like they had to run to another meeting. Todd was agreeing with you, Hanifi. He said, thank you for articulating it that way. We're public schools. We are accountable for serving diverse students and communities, not just the ones who are like us. So excellent, excellent thoughts there. Another one says, there are many books to be used with younger children. In some schools, this might be some kids only exposure to people of color or diversity in any way. So definitely making sure, like even down to your school libraries and the books that you're using, make sure that they are as inclusive as they can and should be. Excellent point. So we'll kind of here with this last thought then. And like I said, I know we're scratching the tip of the iceberg. So I hope that you will take some good things from this meeting and plan to come back and let's do this again. So this think about says, when people ask me what to do about racism, and again, this is from that book, White Fragility. So when people ask her what to do about it, the first thing I ask is what has enabled you to be a full, educated, professional adult and not know what to do about racism? Okay. So there's our think about. We'll come back to that. And with that, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper just into how to think about that. So I had a little thinking exercise along with our questions. So the first thing right here, if we're going to do this work, is really looking at, is that true? So for ourselves, if we go back to this quote, and I know even after reading that book, that was where I was at. Like, I don't know what to do about racism. And I am a full professional adult, and I don't know what to do. And so if I start myself through this thinking process, okay, is it true? Marie does not know what to do about racism. Well, yes, absolutely, right? So then if I go to that second question, can I absolutely know? We have got somebody ringing. She said that, can you absolutely know it's true? So is there ever been a time in my life or life, if you're thinking about this for yourself, where you have known what to do about racism? And I can think of at least an experience where I observed something, heard something, saw something, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to act and how to engage in that moment. And so, okay, is it absolutely true? No, it's not. There are times that I do know what to do. Then I think about that third question. How do I react? What happens? How do I show up when I believe that I don't know what to do? And so for me, when I feel like I don't know what to do, I find myself putting walls, wanting to shut down, not wanting to engage in the conversation.
No te la hizo, Jessica.
Feeling like it's not something that I want to even put my effort into because I don't know how to solve it. So then if we go to that fourth question, okay, so if that's how I show up when I believe that thought, then what's the flip of that? Who would I be and how would I react without that thought? So if I thought that I did know what to do, how would that cause me to show up? How would I be and how would I react? And I really spent some time thinking there. Sorry, I think we have somebody's microphone on. But that was kind of the thought process to walk through on this. And then with that, the discussion questions then come up with, what are you leaving with that will have an impact on your students and your school? What's from this very discussion today? And you're right, we don't have all the answers. We haven't completely solved racism. It would be amazing if we could.
Es arreglar primero todo el carro y eso. Digo, no estás pensando en comprar ahorita.
Sorry, we've got a microphone on. Alex, are you able to mute that?
Gloria, I think your mic is on.
Thank you. So really looking at, what action items can you leave with from our conversation today, and how will you ensure that you enact them? So that's kind of where we want to end on today, just, recognizing this is a huge thing. You're not going to solve it in one day, one conversation, but what is something that you can take with you? What is something you can show up with? Recognizing that when we don't want to engage in that, we close off, we stop talking, we feel like it's not worth it, and that's absolutely not the right answer here. But if we're going to show up and we're going to be authentic and we're going to engage and we're going to try to add value to our communities, in our school communities, in our home communities, how do we show up? How do we take action? What's one small thing you can do today? We've got a few comments here. Someone, I have a Black friend who pointed out to me to do something small. Small things will add up. So she decided that she would not scroll past racist comments on Facebook, but would answer them, and I have done it. Nice, that's awesome. What else? What else can we do here? We'll kind of take 2 or 3 minutes and kind of wrap up here. Again, this can just be a question for reflection if you aren't comfortable sharing with what you're going to take away today. But hopefully you'll have something that you feel like you can enact, something you can do, something you can take with you from this conversation. Shelley, I love it. She says, read and learn, learn, learn. Absolutely. I think that there is still so much learning to be done on this topic. I like Jennifer. That says she's going to spend more time listening. Excellent. Dorothy, you got a thumbs up. Speaking up in person or on Facebook rather than staying silent is critical. Someone said they really liked Brett's comments about creating safe spaces for conversation and race. Excellent. I do want to be respectful of your time. I know that USBE, their board meeting, I know a lot of people are really interested in that conversation too, talking about COVID and coming back in person and some of those recommendations. So I absolutely want you to be able to attend that. I did know that they were starting out with executive session today. I'm not sure. Oh, Jennifer just said they're still in closed session. Awesome. Okay, well, in that case, we can talk a little longer, I guess. Jenny Patterson, she asked if Brett can share his policy about creating safe spaces. Brett, would that be something you're willing to share or that you formalized in a policy?
So Maria, it looks like Brett may have stepped off, but that's
okay. I was gonna say Brett's going very quiet here, but I will email him and definitely, you know, get some information from him on that. Let's see. We have some great resources that are all referenced here. There's lots of shout outs to each other. I'm so happy for that. There's a recommendation that everyone should watch 13th if they haven't yet. Someone says, be proactive, help students to build positive awareness of diversity. And I love this one. Our recommendation, have another meeting. And then it says, thank you for organizing. So I agree. Like we said, this is a big topic, definitely not all figured out in one afternoon. So we will plan to hold another one of these. I hope that you found it helpful. I want to definitely practice what I preach. So if there were any parts that you found that you could give me some feedback on, things that I could say or do better, I would happily welcome feedback from you, and I will take it with grace and recognizing that I still have so much to learn. So I will absolutely welcome that from you. If there are specific questions that we haven't addressed yet that you would love to move into one of these leadership conversations, I would also welcome your questions or thoughts or any specific topics that you would like to spend some additional time on. Otherwise, I will keep guiding you as best I can through my own learning and wanting to share with you as well. So thank you so much. And we will then call it a day. Remember, if you would like the recording of this meeting, just shoot me an email and I can get that over to you. Otherwise, I so much appreciate you being here. Thank you for being willing to share and to learn and to grow along with me. And hope you have a wonderful afternoon and take some good things with you. Bye. Alex, is there something specific we need to do to end the meeting?
Nope.